I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I always thought I'd be the last person to deal with something like this. Laura and I had been together for 15 years, 15 years of building a life, raising our 2 kids, making plans for the future. But in hindsight, it wasn't just that we were busy, it was as if a slow crack had formed in the foundation of our marriage. At the time, I didn't see it coming. It started with the little things. Her phone never left her side. She was always quick to silence it when it buzzed. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just work stress. Laura was a financial consultant, and her clients often demanded her attention at odd hours. That's how she explained it anyway. But something about the way she'd go quiet after reading a message or how she'd casually mention late meetings that had never been part of her routine before, it felt off. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, she told me she was going out with her friends. I didn't think much of it. She deserved a break, I figured. After all, we were both juggling work and the responsibilities of being parents. But when she came home well past midnight, smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize, my stomach churned. The next morning, I asked how her night went. "Oh, just the usual," she said with a shrug. No further explanation. The smile she flashed felt more like a mask than anything real. Something inside me snapped a little that day. Call it paranoia, call it intuition, but I felt the need to dig deeper. I wasn't the type to go snooping around in her things, but when her phone rang that night, I felt this pull, a gnawing curiosity. She was in the shower, and the phone sat face up on the nightstand. It was just one look, one glance at the screen, but that was all it took. The name, Nick, flashed across the display, accompanied by a message that read, "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was perfect. Love, Nick." I froze. My mind raced to catch up with what my eyes had just seen. Nick? Who the hell was Nick? And what did he mean by last night? Laura had said she was out with her friends. I dropped the phone back on the nightstand as if it had burned my hand. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I had no time to process it before Laura stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair still wet. She caught my eye, smiled, and walked past me to grab her pajamas. I tried to act normal, as if I hadn't just seen a message that threatened to destroy everything I knew. I managed to mumble something about being tired and climbed into bed, but my mind was far from sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had happened. Who was Nick? Was this a one-time thing, or had it been going on longer? My stomach churned, but I stayed silent. I needed proof, something more concrete than a text message. For the next week, I watched her closely, every glance, every word scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. I paid attention to when she left for work and when she came home. I noticed how often she'd laugh at her phone, a secretive smile playing on her lips. Each night, I waited for her to slip up, to leave her phone unlocked or unattended. But she didn't. I told myself it could have been a misunderstanding. Maybe Nick was a colleague, and I was just overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel the truth, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when we were driving back from a weekend trip, that I had my chance. We were on our way back from the mountains, just a quiet getaway to recharge. On the drive, she said she needed to use the bathroom, so we pulled into a gas station. She left her phone in the cup holder and went inside. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I couldn't stop myself. This time, I scrolled through her messages. There were dozens of them, texts between her and Nick. They went back months. Photos, plans, declarations of love. It was all there, laid out in front of me, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. They had met at a conference, kept in touch, and eventually, it became more than just friendly banter. From what I could gather, they had been seeing each other regularly. While I was at home taking care of the kids, believing my wife was working late or out with friends, she had been with him. My hands shook as I put the phone down. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Laura, the woman I had built my life with, the mother of my children, she was cheating on me. I wanted to scream, to confront her right then and there, but I couldn't. I didn't want to blow up in a gas station parking lot, with the kids asleep in the back seat. So, I did nothing. I just sat there, my mind swirling, my heart in my throat. When she came back to the car, she smiled at me and asked if everything was okay. I forced a smile, nodded, and started the engine. For the rest of the drive home, I barely spoke. I could feel her glance at me a few times, but she didn't push. She was probably relieved I wasn't asking too many questions. That night, while she slept beside me, I lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was it my fault? Had I pushed her away? Was I not enough? Anger boiled inside me, but more than anything, I felt numb. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the deception, the way she had looked me in the eye every day and pretended everything was fine. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I needed more than just angry accusations. I needed solid proof, something I could use to hold her accountable. And I needed to plan my next move carefully. I began tracking her movements, not just with her phone but through her actions. I watched her closely, noting when she left for work, where she went, and how she interacted with me. It was subtle, but now that I knew the truth, every smile, every casual remark felt like a knife to the gut. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Every time she kissed me goodbye or told me she loved me, it took everything in me not to scream, not to call her out on her lies. But I stayed calm, patient. I was waiting for the right moment. And that moment came sooner than I expected. The following week passed in a haze of strained smiles and silent tension. I kept my suspicions locked tight, replaying every interaction with Laura in my mind, searching for clues I had missed. The normalcy of our routine had become a kind of prison. Each morning, we would wake up, get the kids ready for school, exchange pleasantries as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had changed. I was no longer the husband of a loving wife. I was the man whose wife was lying to him every day, sneaking around behind his back, and pretending our life together was still intact. The only thing worse than the anger that simmered beneath the surface was the gnawing sadness. I thought we had been happy. I thought I had been enough for her. But clearly, I wasn't. In the quiet moments, when the kids were at school and Laura was at work, I would sit in my office at home, obsessively scrolling through her messages. It was like picking at an open wound, knowing it would hurt but unable to stop. Each text between her and Nick was like a punch to the gut. They exchanged everything, inside jokes, sweet nothings, even complaints about their spouses. My name came up more than once, always in the context of something I had done wrong, or some emotional need I wasn't fulfilling. It made me sick. But I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I had to bide my time, gather more information, and figure out what my next step would be. The kids didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this, and I didn't want to blow up our lives without a plan. So, I kept playing my part, pretending everything was fine. One evening, Laura came home from work, her mood light and carefree. She hummed softly to herself as she set her purse down on the counter and poured herself a glass of wine. I watched her from the kitchen, my stomach twisting with a mix of anger and confusion. How could she act like this? How could she look me in the eye and smile, knowing what she was doing? "Hey, babe," she said, coming over to kiss me on the cheek. "How was your day?" "Fine," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the dinner I was preparing. I could feel her watching me, waiting for more, but I didn't give her anything. She hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and walked away, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. That night, after the kids were in bed, I waited for her to fall asleep. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, listening to her breathing slow into a steady rhythm. When I was sure she was out, I slipped out of bed and made my way downstairs. My hands shook as I opened her laptop, accessing her email with the password I had memorized weeks ago. I found what I was looking for almost immediately, a chain of emails between her and Nick, discussing their next meeting. It wasn't just an affair. It was an entire relationship, planned and executed with precision. They had dates lined up, weekends away, moments that overlapped with times she had told me she was working late or out with friends. It felt like a movie playing out in slow motion. I could see every moment of their time together, as if I had been there, a silent observer to my own betrayal. But it wasn't the affair that pushed me over the edge, it was what I found at the end of the email chain. A message from Nick, sent earlier that day, detailing a surprise he had for her. He had booked a weekend getaway for the two of them, starting that Friday. Laura had responded with enthusiasm, saying she couldn't wait to see him, that she loved him. I closed the laptop and stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. She was planning to leave me that weekend, without a word, to be with him. I couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, I set my plan in motion. I called Nick's wife, a woman I had never met but who, I imagined, was just as much in the dark as I had been. Her name was Rachel, and her voice trembled when I introduced myself. "I think you should know," I said, keeping my voice calm, "your husband is having an affair with my wife." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a shaky breath. What are you talking about?" "I found their messages. I have proof. They've been seeing each other for months." Rachel didn't speak for a long time, but I could hear her breathing, shallow and quick, the way someone breathes when they're trying not to panic. I knew that feeling all too well. "I'm sorry to do this to you," I continued, "but I thought you deserved to know. They're planning a weekend getaway together. This Friday." She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could he?" "I don't know," I said, my voice tight. "But I think we should do something about it." Together, we devised a plan. It wasn't just about confronting them. It was about exposing them, making sure they couldn't weasel their way out of it with excuses or half-truths. I wasn't just going to confront Laura in private. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she had done, and I wanted her to feel it publicly. Friday arrived faster than I expected. Laura left the house that morning, dressed casually, with her overnight bag slung over her shoulder. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, saying she'd be back late from work. I smiled, playing my part, and watched her walk out the door. The moment she was gone, I packed my own bag and drove to the restaurant where they were supposed to meet. Rachel was already there, sitting at a table by the window, her eyes red from crying but her expression set with determination. We didn't speak much as we waited, but there was an understanding between us, a shared pain that needed no words. An hour later, I saw them. Laura and Nick, walking in together, laughing, holding hands like a couple of lovesick teenagers. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and heartbreak, but I held it together. I had to. They didn't notice us at first. Laura was too focused on Nick, too caught up in the excitement of their secret romance. It wasn't until they sat down that she looked up and saw me. Her smile froze, her face going pale as she locked eyes with me. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Rachel stood beside me, her gaze fixed on Nick, who was now staring at us in shock. "Surprise," I said, my voice cold. Laura's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Nick looked like a deer caught in headlights, his face flushing with panic. For a moment, none of us spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of us, suffocating. Finally, Laura broke the silence, her voice trembling. This isn't what it looks like." I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the restaurant. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like. Before she could respond, I pulled out my phone and dropped it on the table in front of her. On the screen were all the messages I had saved, every text, every email, every sordid detail of her affair with Nick. She stared at the phone, her eyes wide with shock. "How could you?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How could you lie to me like this? To our family?" She started to cry, but I wasn't having it. This wasn't the time for tears. This was the time for reckoning. "I want you out of the house," I said, my voice steady. "I'll have the papers drawn up next week." Laura's face crumpled, but I turned away before she could say anything else. I walked out of the restaurant, my heart heavy but resolute. I had done what I needed to do. There was no going back now. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. The moment I walked out of that restaurant, my mind felt numb. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully hit me yet. It was like I had been moving on autopilot, every step leading up to that confrontation carefully calculated, planned, and executed. But now, with the dust settling behind me, the rawness of it all began to seep in. I drove home in silence. The quiet car felt like a tomb, sealing in all the pain and unanswered questions. What had I done wrong? Had there been signs I'd missed from the start? Was there something broken in me that had pushed her away? Those thoughts gnawed at me relentlessly, sinking their teeth in deeper with each passing mile. By the time I pulled into our driveway, night had fallen, and the house was dark. The kids were spending the weekend with my parents, so there was no need to explain the mess their parents were about to unravel. I was thankful for that. At least they wouldn't have to see the immediate aftermath of this disaster. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, and dropped my keys on the kitchen counter. The emptiness of the house swallowed me whole. I stood there, staring at the place that had been my home for over a decade, and it felt foreign. It was no longer the warm, safe space where Laura and I had built a life together. It was a shell, just walls, furniture, and memories that now felt tainted. I made my way upstairs, each step heavier than the last. When I reached our bedroom, I paused at the door. It looked exactly the same as when I had left it earlier that morning, but it felt different now. The bed where we had slept side by side for years, the pictures of our family on the dresser, the clothes in the closet, they were all reminders of a life that had shattered in the space of an evening. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. For a long time, I just sat there, the silence wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to cry, to let out all the anger and pain I had been holding inside, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a hollow ache, a numbness that spread through my entire body. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my daze. I pulled it out, my heart sinking when I saw Laura's name flashing on the screen. She was calling me. I wasn't ready to talk to her, not yet, maybe not ever. I let it ring until it stopped, but almost immediately, it started again. This time, I answered. "Mark," her voice was shaky, thick with tears. Please let me explain." "What's there to explain?" I said, my voice cold, sharper than I intended. "I've seen everything I need to see. You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer. There's nothing left to say." She let out a choked sob. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't." "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I snapped, my anger flaring. "You didn't mean to cheat on me? To lie to me? What, it just happened. You just accidentally fell into another man's arms. Please, Mark," her voice was barely a whisper now. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I cut her off again. You hurt more than me, Laura. You destroyed our family. You lied to me, to the kids. And for what? For some fling with Nick? Do you even know what you've done?" "I do," she cried, her voice rising in desperation. I know, okay? I know I've ruined everything. But I didn't want it to end like this. I still love you. I laughed bitterly at that, the sound hollow in the quiet room. Love me? You don't get to say that, Laura. You don't get to throw that word around after what you've done. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, the sound uneven, like she was struggling to keep herself together. I'm coming home, she said finally, her voice small and broken. We can talk about this, please. We can figure something out. No, I said firmly, standing up from the bed, the anger giving me strength I didn't know I had. There's nothing to figure out. I told you already, I want you out of the house. I'll have the divorce papers drawn up next week. You can come by and pick up your things and I'm not here. Mark, please, she pleaded. Don't do this. I love you. I love our family. Don't throw it all away because of one mistake. One mistake? I repeated, incredulous. This wasn't a mistake, Laura. This was a choice. You chose him. You chose to sneak around behind my back. You chose to betray me. This isn't something you can just apologize for and expect everything to go back to normal. Her sobs grew louder, more desperate, but I couldn't let myself feel sympathy for her. Not now. Maybe not ever. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice steady but tired. It's over. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking as I dropped the phone onto the bed. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, half expecting her to call again. But she didn't. The silence settled in once more, thick and oppressive. I walked over to the window, staring out into the night. The street outside was quiet, the lights from the neighboring houses casting long shadows on the pavement. It felt surreal, like the world was moving on while mine had come to a screeching halt. I thought about the kids. They had no idea what was happening, how their mother had betrayed us, how our family was falling apart. How would I explain this to them? How could I make them understand that their mother had chosen someone else over us? Over the life we had built together? The thought of their faces, their innocent questions, made my chest tighten. I didn't want them to suffer because of this. I didn't want them to feel like they were losing both their parents because of Laura's actions. But there was no escaping it. No matter how much I tried to shield them from the truth, they would eventually find out. And when they did, I'd have to be the one to pick up the pieces. I spent the next few hours in a daze, moving from room to room, aimlessly picking up things and putting them down again. Everything reminded me of Laura, her clothes in the closet, the pictures on the walls, the smell of her perfume lingering in the air. It was unbearable, suffocating. I wanted to tear it all down, to throw everything out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I collapsed on the couch, exhausted. My mind was too tired to think, too drained to process the magnitude of what had happened. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was stuck in the middle of a nightmare with no way out. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it finally did, it was restless, plagued by dreams of Laura and Nick, of their lies and the life I thought I had. I woke up the next morning feeling more drained than before, the weight of it all still heavy on my chest. There was no escaping it now. The facade had crumbled, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken life. I had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The days following my confrontation with Laura felt like walking through a fog. Every moment was a blur, every interaction hollow. I hadn't seen her since that night at the restaurant. She had stayed at a friend's place, at least according to a brief, cold text she sent me the next morning. It didn't matter where she was. I was more focused on figuring out how to put my life back together, how to tell the kids, how to start the process of divorce. But there was something I hadn't anticipated in all of this. Beneath the layers of anger and betrayal, there was grief, real, gut-wrenching grief that threatened to consume me every time I stopped moving, every time I let myself sit in silence. I was grieving the loss of the life I thought I had, the future I thought was certain. For the first week, I kept myself busy with the logistics, meeting with a divorce lawyer, gathering documents, preparing for the conversation with the kids. But there were moments when I would sit alone in the quiet house and feel the full weight of what had happened. The ache in my chest was unbearable. By the end of that week, Laura had asked if we could sit down and talk, for the kids, she said. I knew what she really wanted, to try to explain, to salvage whatever was left. But there was nothing left to salvage. Still, for the sake of closure, I agreed. We arranged to meet at the house when the kids were at school. The day arrived, gray and drizzling with a cold rain that seemed to mirror the mood I couldn't shake. I waited for her in the kitchen, sipping my coffee and trying to steady my nerves. The sound of her car pulling into the driveway sent my heart racing. Even after everything, there was a part of me that still responded to her presence, still remembered the years we had shared. The door opened, and Laura walked in, looking smaller than I remembered. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty that made her seem almost fragile. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with dark circles, as if she hadn't slept since that night. She glanced at me, and for a second, our eyes met, just a flicker of the past, the ghosts of the people we once were, staring back at each other. "Hey," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "Hey." I nodded, setting down my coffee. "You want something to drink?" She shook her head. "No, thanks." An awkward silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable. She shifted on her feet, unsure of where to begin. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. If she wanted to talk, she would have to start. Finally, she spoke. I don't even know where to start. I know I can't ask for your forgiveness, Mark. I've made too many mistakes. I stared at her, waiting. It was the same line I had heard before, but I stayed quiet, letting her continue. I've been thinking about everything. About us, about what I've done, and, she hesitated, her voice breaking. And I know I've destroyed everything that mattered. You, the kids, our life together, I took it all for granted. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to respond, to tell her how obvious that was. She didn't need to hear it from me. She already knew. I was selfish, she went on, her voice trembling. I wanted something. I don't even know what I was chasing. It wasn't worth it. None of it was worth it. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together nervously. I want to try to make this right, Mark. For the kids, for us, if we can. I know I don't deserve it, but if there's any part of you that still believes we can fix this, I want to try. I stared at her, my chest tightening. I had spent so many nights lying awake, imagining what it would be like to hear those words. But now, in this moment, they felt empty. I didn't feel relief or hope. I just felt tired. So tired of the lies, of the pain, of the endless loop of betrayal and regret. We can't, I said quietly, shaking my head. There's nothing left to fix, Laura. It's too late. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. She knew, deep down, that it was the truth. We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what else to say. The rain pattered against the windows, filling the empty space between us. Finally, she stood up, wiping her eyes. I'll leave. I'll let you know when I'll come by for my things. I nodded, standing up as well. Take care of yourself, Laura. She paused at the door, looking back at me one last time. I'm sorry, Mark. I really am. I didn't respond. I just watched as she walked out the door and into the rain, disappearing from view. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of closure, like the wound was finally starting to scab over. But it wasn't enough. The grief was still there, deep and unrelenting. I had won, hadn't I? I had exposed her lies, gotten my revenge, and now I was free to move on. But it didn't feel like a victory. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the emptiness that hung over everything. I told myself that with time, things would get better. That the sadness would fade, and I'd start to feel like myself again. But the call I got one cold, rainy afternoon shattered that hope. It was Laura's friend, her voice frantic and tearful. I could barely make out the words through her sobs, but when I finally understood what she was saying, the world collapsed beneath my feet. Laura had been in an accident. She had driven off the road, her car skidding on the wet pavement, flipping over before crashing into a tree. She was gone. Just like that, in an instant. The weight of it hit me all at once, knocking the breath out of me. I sat down on the floor, clutching the phone in disbelief, my mind refusing to process the words I had just heard. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. I had imagined a future where we co-parented, where we somehow navigated the mess of our broken marriage for the sake of the kids. But now that future was gone. Laura was gone. I don't remember much after that. The funeral was a blur of tears and condolences, the kids' faces pale with shock as they tried to understand why their mother wasn't coming back. I tried to be strong for them, but I was falling apart inside. The guilt, the anger, the sadness, it was all too much. I had wanted justice, but all I had now was loss. Late at night, after the kids had gone to bed, I would sit in the dark, staring at the empty space beside me where Laura used to sleep. The silence was deafening. All the words I hadn't said, all the forgiveness I hadn't given, it haunted me. I had wanted revenge, but now all I wanted was one more chance. One more moment to hold her, to tell her that despite everything, I still loved her. But that chance was gone. And all I was left with was the unbearable weight of regret.